Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Macis, who is Professor of Economics at Johns Hopkins University. His research interests include how economic incentives interact with psychological factors and social norms to drive individual behavior and policy-relevant outcomes. In particular, he studies the role of incentives in shaping pro-social behavior and attitudes toward morally controversial exchanges. Recently, these two lines of work converged into a research agenda aimed at understanding what determines social support for market-based solutions to social problems. Welcome, Mario.
Hi, Gil. It's good to be with you.
I want to start with one of your papers entitled Economic Rewards to Motivate Blood Donations, in which you say the position and guidelines of the World Health Organization's WHO and several national blood collection agencies for nearly 40 years have been based on the view that offering economic incentives to blood donors is detrimental to the quantity and safety of the blood supply. You say that evidence consistent with the WHO position came originally from uncontrolled studies using non-random samples and subsequently from surveys and laboratory studies, indicating that economic incentives can crowd out intrinsic motivations to donate and can attract worse donors. So there are two problems here, Mario. One is how WHO reached those conclusions in terms of whether incentives are a bad thing or not, or good thing or not, and the overarching concern, if incentives are in place, whether you have a biased selection issue with the donors, right? You want to talk a bit about that paper?
Yeah, sure. So that paper is essentially the culmination of a broader research program that I conducted with two other economists, Nicola Cetera and Bob Slonim, where we worked with blood banks in the US and in other countries to basically to understand the potential role of incentives in stimulating blood donation. So taking a step back, like we know that giving blood saves lives, and at the same time, look, donating blood it's a costly activity to people in terms of time, discomfort, and there are many altruistic donors, out there who just give and without any reward, and that is wonderful. But in spite of that, there are shortages of blood, and this is the background to that work that you refer to. There are shortages of blood. There isn't enough blood supplied to meet the demand. Shortages are frequent in many countries. In some countries, like in wealthy countries, the shortages are seasonal, whereas in other countries they are more chronic. But in any case, The shortages are, of course, undesirable because, when hospitals run out of blood for transfusion, then there are surgeries that need to postpone, and in some cases, surgeries and other types of interventions that cannot happen, and that has bad consequences for patients. And so, look, as an economist, so when we observe, when you observe sort of as an economist a shortage in a context, in a market, then you immediately sort of look at the price, and in this case, so you think there might be something wrong with the price, right?
Yeah.
And so in this case, there's no price because in most countries around the world, blood donors are not paid. And like you said, there's a concern with providing a set of concerns with providing economic incentives to blood donors. One is that the incentives could crowd out donors' intrinsic motivation. So donors' desire to donate, in order to do good, could be that type of motivation could be crowded out by explicit incentives. And so in theory, it's possible that as a result of introducing incentives, you might get fewer donations, not more donations. The second concern that you refer to is that the safety of the blood supply could be jeopardized by introducing incentives if incentives end up attracting a different type of donors who are perhaps more likely to engage in risky behaviors or behaviors that make them more likely to develop infectious diseases. So those are sort of two big concerns. And with my co-authors, we essentially, started doing a set of empirical studies in collaboration with blood banks to understand empirically, what happens when you provide economic incentives to blood donors.
So one thing I was wondering, Mario. So obviously, there were a lot of concerns about transmissible infections like HIV and hepatitis and so on. But those things sort of have abated, right? So perhaps that is less of a concern today than perhaps, maybe 10 years ago. But I was also wondering, I know that you didn't do this in this paper. So the crowding out effect, if there is some sort of a market-based mechanism, like if you can titrate, the incentive mechanism, if there is, sufficient amount of blood, there is no incentive. If there is, a dearth of blood supply, there is higher incentives. I don't know if any experiment like that was done, or whether it is, just looking at incentive or no incentive.
So that's the thing, right? So in theory, you could have different types of effects of providing incentives to different types of individuals depending on their motivation, right? The effects could be different, but that's exactly why. This is one big reason why we developed that empirical research agenda that we did. In particular, we worked with the American Red Cross in Northern Ohio. They very generously shared a bunch of data with us, which we analyzed and studying the effect of rewards of different kinds, from mugs to T-shirts to pins, coupons, jackets, and so on. And one sort of empirical regularity that we found was that these incentives, these rewards, had a positive effect on blood donations. We also did a randomized control trial where we used purely economic rewards because one could argue that if you're looking at the effect, if you're studying the effect of a T-shirt and the T-shirt has the Red Cross logo, then the positive effect could be due to a social sort of image or social signaling that by wearing the Red Cross T-shirt, I'm indicating to society that I'm a certain type of person, I'm a good person, I give blood, and so that positive effect could be due to that instead of the monetary or dollar value of the T-shirt. So what we did with the randomized control trial, we offered a variety of gift cards for $5, $10, or $15, and people could choose from a variety of stores, of gift cards from different stores. So we remove the social value, if you want, of the reward, and focused only on a purely economical type of reward. But again, we found similar positive effects of gift cards on blood donation, and the effects were increasing in the value of the gift card. So the $15 gift card had a larger effect than the $10 and the $5 gift card. And also, coming to your question about the heterogeneity, the different types of people, different types of donors potentially reacting in different ways. We didn't actually find that. We found that the positive effects sort of, we found them across the board, like for younger donors, older donors, more frequent donors, less frequent donors. So we weren't able to really identify any donor category that did not show an increased propensity to donate blood in response to the economic rewards.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So this is a large study, Mario. So this is a field experiment, another one of your papers in Northern Ohio, like you said, almost 100,000 blood donors. So it's a fairly large study. And so if we are finding, sort of a binary observation that some people can be incentivized to provide blood and some don't need those incentives. I didn't know these numbers. You say in the paper, the volunteer time in the United States, estimated value of volunteer time on all activities, about 240 billion. 27% of Americans volunteer with formal organizations for a total of about 8 billion hours per year. And so there's a very active non-incentive based volunteer activity happening in the US. And so the blood donor problem specifically, what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, Mario, is that you find a positive effect of providing incentives, but whether the type of incentives or the quantity of the incentives don't seem to have that much of a relationship.
So yeah, we did do that large scale randomized control study that you have referred to. Another finding from the study, by the way, is that we had a measure of the quality of the blood collected, a proxy for the quality of the blood collected, which was the percentage of donors presenting to donate that were deferred. They were not. So whose blood could not be or was not collected because those donors presented some risk factors. That proportion fluctuates between 10, 13, 15% normally, and we did not find any relationship, any effect of the incentives on that proportion, the proportion of donors who are ineligible to donate, which was our proxy for the quality of the blood supply. And so from that finding, that finding suggests that the concern that incentives attract the wrong type of donor, that there isn't a lot of empirical support for at least not in our data for that claim. Another important finding was that there was a little bit of intertemporal, what we call intertemporal sort of substitution. Essentially, in part, the positive effect of the incentives, so the incentives increased donations at the drives where they were offered. In part, that increase was due to some donors donating there at that time when the incentive was offered, instead of at some point in the future. So we basically, the incentives shifted donations away from the future and into sort of the present at the time when incentives were offered. So this type of intertemporal substitution is potentially useful because, as I mentioned earlier, in the US specifically, blood shortages tend to be seasonal. Like around the holidays, blood banks find it harder to recruit donors and collect blood around holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, in the summer. And so if incentives can be used to again, induce people to donate when at times of the year when donations are more needed instead of when they are more abundant, then that's an additional way in which incentives can provide social value. And so to go back to the initial paper, you started asking me about a paper that my co-authors and I published in Science, where we summarize the available evidence at the time. So it's not just our papers. There's like now a body of evidence that has looked at blood donor incentives in multiple countries and of many different types that all seem to point to, you can actually use incentives in a way that is not incompatible with altruism, and that can actually reinforce donors, intrinsic motivation to do good. So that's sort of, the lesson that we sort of drew from the available evidence in that paper.
So in general, this appears to be a good thing, both in terms of willingness to donate blood, as well as the intertemporal substitution that you talked about, indicate that when there is scarcity of blood, if you provide incentives, you will get a blood donation. And there doesn't appear to be, this concern that people who donate blood with incentives, may have issues, and so you have that bias selection problem that doesn't appear to be there.
You said, maybe 40 years ago, this would have been a bigger concern compared to today, because today we've got a lot, the technology has gotten so much better at identifying sort of, contaminated blood, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I want to jump into another paper, Understanding Societal Support for Monetary Compensation to Plasma Donors in Canada. So, in which this paper you say examples of transactions that raise or have raised moral concerns, often leading to the prohibition, including prostitution, same-sex marriage, and other type of things, markets for human organs for transplantation. We'll talk about kidneys in a later paper here. All of those issues, you have some observations here. You have three different countries that you're looking at: Canada, United States, and Australia. In United States, it is legal to pay for blood donation, but it's not the case in Canada. So you're looking at these two countries to maybe draw some conclusions.
Yeah. So yes. So the transactions that you refer to, economics Nobel laureate Alvin Roth, he labeled them as a repugnant transactions. So these are transactions where the parties would be willing to engage in an exchange, sometimes involving money, for example, paying for plasma, but others who are not involved in the transaction, they object to the exchange and they would like to prevent it. To prohibit the exchange from taking place. An example of this type of debate and policy conversation is payments for plasma in Canada. In recent years, there's been a lot of debate in Canada about whether or not Canadian plasma donors should be allowed to be compensated, to be paid. Like you said, paying plasma donors is legal in the US, and the donation of plasma, by the way, involves more time compared to the donation of whole blood. Plasma donors need to go to a plasma donation center, and the process of giving plasma takes about an hour, sometimes even longer. And the plasma donors are paid in the US. They're not typically paid in Canada. But and plasma is extremely important, is an extremely important source of therapies for the treatment of many types of blood diseases, blood cancers, leukemia, and of course, there's a need for plasma-derived therapies in Canada. Turns out that there isn't enough plasma being collected in Canada to satisfy the demand for those plasma-derived therapies for Canadian patients. And what happens is that Canada relies heavily And so does Australia, by the way, where again plasma donor payments are prohibited. But those countries rely on imported plasma from the U.S. and therefore from paid U.S. donors. So this situation where payments are prohibited in some countries, but those same countries rely on imported plasma and therapies from the US and also from Germany. That's another country where plasma payments or compensation is allowed. That prompted the study of Canadians that you referred to. So the broad question that we had was, what do Canadians think about paying plasma donors? Do they think that the plasma donors should not be paid, that it's immoral, that it's unethical to pay plasma donors in general? Or are they fine with American donors being paid, but Canadian donors should not be paid? So we wanted to, given the policy conversation in Canada, given that many provinces and also the central government was considering passing legislation, and in some cases passed legislation that prohibited plasma donor compensation. We wanted to understand, what Canadian citizens thought about those issues, and so that was sort of the motivation for the study.
And there are no recent changes in those policies, right? Those policies have been in existence for a long time, both in those Canadian provinces as
there
well as
have
in the
been
United
some.
States.
So yeah, that's right. In the United States, the policy has been in place for a long time. Oh, and by the way, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. The plasma collections are very robust. The plasma industry is robust, and the U.S. is a big exporter of plasma. I might forget the exact figure, but I believe that about 1.6, 1.8% of U.S. exports are plasma products exports. It's a very big proportion. And many countries, again, around the world rely on, and many patients around the world rely on plasma and plasma therapies from the US.
So your survey here is basically getting to sort of a 2x2 matrix. How do you feel about the Canadian policy? How do you feel about essentially importing from the United States, where it is legal to pay for plasma donors? And so you're trying to sort of tease out, how they feel about the local policy and how they feel about, in general, more at the macro level, paying for plasma. And so what
exactly.
did you find?
So you characterize the work, perfectly. We found that Canadians, our sample was representative of Canadian residents. We found that about 70% of Canadians are actually in favor of compensating plasma donors or paying plasma donors. And that proportion was roughly the same, sort of regardless of the citizenship of the donor. So Canadians are okay with American plasma donors being paid, but they're also okay. The majority are in favor of Canadian plasma donors being compensated, being paid. So we didn't find any evidence of moral relativism, by which it's okay. It's not okay for us, for Canadians to get paid for plasma, but it's okay for Americans, to get paid for plasma. It was one hypothesis that we had, but we didn't find any support for that hypothesis. There's a sort of acceptance of compensating plasma donors sort of across the board.
And you found almost the same in Australia. Again, Australia, sort of a mirror image of Canada, where it is illegal in Australia to pay donors of plasma. And Australia, I think, is also importing plasma.
That's
from the
absolutely
States,
correct.
right?
Yes, Australia. In Australia, it is illegal to pay plasma donors, and Australia also relies on imported plasma from the US for their plasma therapies, plasma to produce therapies. And we find that Canadians are also okay with Australian plasma donors being paid. Again, no evidence of moral. We call it moral NIMBYism, not in my backyard morality. We don't find any evidence of that in the case of
Australia. Okay, and so if I understand these numbers correctly, Mario, what you're saying is that about 3/4 of the population, regardless of their location, policy, etc., feel it's okay to pay donors for plasma for plasma donors, and a quarter approximately don't believe it's the right thing to do. Now, like we discussed before, I guess we haven't really dug into uh, the different types of compensation. So one thing I was thinking about is how do they feel about just reimbursing the cost to the donor? So as you said, the plasma donation takes longer. So somebody taking time off work, transportation, and so on, that is not really really paying for plasma, but really compensating the donor for the cost they're incurring in the process. I don't know if there was any sense of any information from the study
not
on that.
specifically from our Canada study. There is sort of anecdotal evidence that people are more comfortable, or that there are far fewer ethical concerns for compensation that takes the form of reimbursement of costs. Also in the ethics and the bioethics community, the objections to paying for body parts, blood, plasma, or even organs for transplantation, those ethical objections are stronger. The concern that vulnerable, poor populations might be unduly pressured into donating because of the promise of a monetary reward, or that they would be exploited again by if we allowed payments for body parts. Those concerns tend to be less strong or absent altogether when compensation is a reimbursement for costs. Like even again in the bioethics community, there's a widespread consensus, I would say, that nobody should be made financially worse off from an act of altruism, from the act of donating, say, a kidney or even plasma or blood. That nobody should be made worse off. And so there are no ethical objections to reimbursing people for their costs. The ethical objections arise for payments that are sort of beyond. They go beyond that,
or are perceived to be profits for
yes,
so
I think
right?
the key concern is that the offer of a monetary, particularly a monetary reward, particularly when the reward is considerable in size. The concern is that promise or offer might induce people to make decisions that they would later regret, or that are not really in their best interest, or that they would get into make those decisions without really considering all potential downsides or costs, that the promise of a reward would make them focus on the money too much, and thereby sort of disregarding potential harms or harmful consequences. So that is sort of the concern, in addition to a broader ethical concern that is just immoral, is just against sort of human dignity, or that paying for body parts commodifies the human body. And some people believe that is just wrong per se, that there is an absolute sort of moral value that is violated when we attach a dollar value or price on a body part.
Yeah. So another interesting result here. So we said approximately 3/4 favor payments. You say respondents who are in favor of payments to plasma donors place great importance on guaranteeing a robust domestic supply of plasma. Now, I think I don't have it in front of me. There was of that quarter who object to this idea. Maybe half of them say that they will prefer a policy change if the domestic supply can be guaranteed to be 100%. And so this concern about exports being not reliable, and I think this is probably a more serious concern now with COVID-19. It seems to push the quarter who say they're not in favor in the other direction.
No, that's a great point and question. So you're right. COVID-19 has sort of exposed the fragility of global supply chains, and in fact, in our paper, which preceded COVID-19, one of the concerns that the Canadian respondents seemed to have was this of guaranteeing a sufficient domestic supply, without relying excessively on imports. And you did, So we mentioned earlier that about 70-something% of the respondents were in favor of compensating donors, with the remaining 25-30% being against. And of those who were against, we studied the reasons for their opposition. Some of them objected based on a misconception that plasma from paid donors is unsafe. The past 20 years, there have been in the US, with paid plasma donors, there have been no incidents of contaminated plasma, and to a large extent, this is because of regulation, of course, but also because of technological advances in the way in which donated plasma gets screened, donors get screened, and the plasma gets tested and essentially cleaned. There's a process through which infectious agents that might be in the plasma get essentially killed. And that process is extremely reliable and safe. So it is sort of a concern of several of those Canadian respondents who are against paying plasma donors, but that concern is sort of misplaced. It's based on a misconception. Another fraction of those who are opposed to paying plasma donors, they are just opposed as a matter of sort of because of an absolute moral concern. It's just wrong, according to them, to pay donors, regardless of any effects that compensation might have on the supply of plasma. But about half of those who are against compensating plasma donors, about half of them, they would be willing to sort of change their mind, if you want, if the domestic supply of plasma were threatened by, say, if the domestic supply of plasma were seriously threatened, if the imports from the US were to stop specifically, then those individuals would be okay with allowing compensating Canadian plasma donors if doing so would guarantee that Canadian patients can actually obtain the plasma and the therapies that they need. So this willingness to tolerate or accept a transaction that they dislike, because those are, again, individuals who don't like the idea of paying plasma donors, but they're willing to say yes if there is a sufficient gain for society, in this case for patients. That was I think one interesting finding from our study, that the opposition for half of those who are against is not absolute in nature, but it can be sort of relaxed if there is a sufficient societal gain to sort of compensate, right? To compensate for allowing an exchange that they dislike.
Yeah, so that's interesting, Mario. So you mentioned before there is no evidence for moral relativism. That is true for three-quarters of the population, but the remaining quarter, you say half of them is really indicating sort of a moral relativism, right? Meaning, yeah, I will change my mind if there is a problem of supply. So 10-15% of them are really practicing moral
Well, I'm not
relativism.
sure
Have
that I
I
would
understood you?
characterize that as moral relativism. There are competing values, right? And in ethics, just like in economics,
Okay.
there are trade-offs. In ethics, the things are similar because, on the one hand, you've got this, again, reasons to oppose paying plasma donors. But on the other hand, you've got patients who rely on plasma therapies. And so for this, 15% of individuals, the balance between these competing interests shifts when the supply of plasma is seriously threatened. And so yes, in a way, so yes, they are willing to make a trade-off between competing values. That's how I would phrase this.
Yeah, it could also be sort of an efficiency argument, meaning I'm okay if things are, sort of in steady state, and I don't want to, really kind of rock the boat. But if there is a supply problem, then I'm willing to
Yes,
consider a
that's right.
change
That's
in
a
the
that's a good way
policy.
to put it.
Yeah, yeah. I want to jump into another paper. Clearly, giving blood and giving plasma is one thing. Giving a body part is another, because the cost related to that is potentially a lot higher. So, you have this paper entitled "Paying for Kidneys: A Randomized Survey and Choice Experiment," in which you look at 2,700 or so US residents to study preferences for legalizing payments to kidney donors. And you say that we found strong polarization with many participants supporting or opposing payments, regardless of potential
Yeah,
transplant gain. So
yeah,
can you talk a
that
bit about
paper
that?
is again part of a broader research agenda with two economists again, Julio Elias, who's an economist in Buenos Aires, and Nicola Cetera, who's also an economist at the University of Toronto. And in that paper, we ask the question, what do Americans think about paying kidney donors? So the background for this is that in the U.S., but this is the case also in pretty much all countries around, virtually all countries around the world, there is a shortage of organs for transplantation, in particular of kidneys for transplantation. And in the U.S., there's a long waiting list of 100,000 people of kidney patients who would like to obtain a kidney, but many of them are unable to obtain one, and in fact, several thousands of individuals, of patients, die unfortunately every year because they're unable to find a donor. And others drop out of the waiting list because they become too sick to obtain a transplant. The alternative to a kidney transplant for patients with end-stage renal disease is dialysis. There are, which is it's nice that there is an alternative, but dialysis is very expensive. Dialysis also, worsens people's quality of life considerably. It also provides with a sort of a patients with the lower life expectancy compared to kidney patients who are able to obtain a transplant. So there are strong arguments and strong need. There is a strong need for increasing the number of kidney transplants.
Yeah, these numbers are very striking, Mario. So, 100,000 patients are waiting for kidney in the United States alone. 2018 numbers, and the average wait is about 4.5 years. You say. while receiving dialysis. As you mentioned, it's extremely expensive. So that's a long time. And several thousand people die each year as they cannot find a donor kidney. So you estimate here kidney shortage has an economic cost of approximately 3 billion
That
annually,
is
and I'm
just for the
assuming that's just for
U.S.
the U.S.
And that is due to the lives that are being lost, the cost of dialysis. I mean, the difference between a patient that receives a kidney transplant and a patient that stays on dialysis is large. A difference in cost. It is estimated that each kidney transplant generates about $150,000 savings to taxpayers in the US, largely because dialysis and kidney care more generally, Medicare pays for it regardless of age. So to a very large extent, dialysis expenses in the US are financed by taxpayers. So in addition, to transplants, having more transplants would save lives, which is very desirable by itself. Of course, there are also financial benefits for society and for taxpayers in particular from increasing the number of transplants. Now, economists and other sort of have suggested that we should consider compensating kidney donors. There are estimates that suggest that particularly living kidney donors face substantial financial costs, direct and indirect, from the donation, between $20,000 and $40,000. Those are big costs for a donor. And again, there's consensus that nobody should be made financially worse off from a kidney donation. So in that paper, the paper that you are referring to, we're trying to understand Americans' attitudes towards paying kidney donors, and we essentially asked them, look, to consider hypothetical scenarios in which kidney donors receive payment. And if you ask me, to summarize the results or to give you the most important result, the first result that I would like to highlight from that paper is that there seems to be a substantial fraction of Americans who are in favor of paying kidney donors, regardless of about 50% would be in favor of compensating paying kidney donors, regardless of any effects on the supply of kidneys. For about 50% of our respondents, it is actually desirable that for kidney donors to get compensated. And then the fraction of respondents who are in favor of paying kidney donors increases as the hypothesized increase in the supply of kidneys increases. This is a result that is similar to the finding from the Canadian study, that when the gains from allowing a transaction are sufficiently large, then more people become in favor of making that transaction legal, of allowing that transaction to take place, even among those who initially were not so keen on the transaction, on making the transaction legal. When they get sufficiently large, become.
So would you say, Mario, that cohort of people are assuming that a payment is not going to substantially change the supply? So you say here 57% of the respondents would support paid donor system in case of no transplant gains, and about 70% would favor compensation when the system is assumed to satisfy 100% of demand. And so is there an implicit assumption here that the people who are opposing this believe that it wouldn't really matter?
So
it wouldn't really increase supply?
The simple answer is we really don't have a good sense of the potential effect of introducing compensation for kidney donors. There are some studies that have looked at the effects of certain types of reimbursements. For example, reimbursements for travel expenses, lodging expenses. And those studies have found a positive effect. When you reimburse for those types of expenses, donations tend to go up. But there is no real world, empirical study of because it's prohibited, because it's illegal to pay kidney donors. There is no empirical study of what happens when you pay kidney donors. So what we did in the study is we presented respondents with hypothetical scenarios. And we did find, like you said, that some people start out by being against paying kidney donors for for small benefits or no benefits or small benefits for society in terms of additional transplants. But then when they hypothesized growth in the number of transplants made possible by incentives, again, in these hypothetical scenarios, when that number was larger, a considerable share of individuals switched from being against to being in favor, which suggests that, again, if the societal gains from allowing a form of sort of market mechanism to be in place, if the societal gains of that are large enough, then a substantial share of individuals become favorable, are willing to switch from being against to being in favor.
Yeah, so in both cases, the Canadian case as well as the case that we're discussing now, there appears to be sort of lack of information, lack of education in the broader public for them to actually make a more informed decision. And that might have a policy impact. The other area that you explored here is also, you say, although most respondents are in favor of donors being paid, there is strong opposition to patients paying.
Oh yeah, that's the other
so you want to
major
elaborate on that?
finding from the paper. So essentially, we find that Americans dislike the idea of having sort of a free market where people are able to engage in private transactions involving kidneys and money, and that is because they consider it to be unjust or unfair that a person who has the means to procure a kidney for themselves, like a rich person would be able to obtain a kidney by paying a donor and therefore have their life saved, whereas a poor person or someone with no health insurance, with no means to pay for the kidney would not and would die. So there's a strong this taste or aversion to this type of scenario. But there is a lot more sort of approval for an alternative system where a government agency, a public agency, pays the donors or compensates the donors for their kidney, and the same agency allocates the resulting kidneys among patients who need a kidney, but where the allocation is not based on purchasing power, but it's based on medical need and other objective criteria. So based on an algorithm, essentially, that allocates kidneys fairly. So the opposition is not an opposition to to kidney donors being compensated or being paid. In large measure, the concern is that the rich will be able to obtain a kidney, whereas the poor would not. But if you arrange an institutional system, for example, in the paper we hypothesize a public agency, you sort of decouple the procurement from the allocation. So the public agency pays the donors and then allocates kidneys fairly. Then there's a lot more support among Americans for this type of system.
Right. Yeah. So I was thinking about this, Mari. I want to get your perspective on it. And so what people are saying is that yeah, so some sort of intermediary that is unbiased, like the government acquires and allocates, and it's okay for the government to pay for the kidneys. Um, uh, at the highest level, one could argue that acquisition and allocation may need to be separated because allocation
Correct.
is more of a medical decision making process, which government may not have a lot of expertise in. But I could also argue that both acquisition and the pricing of a transaction, as well as allocation, could be completely done by algorithms, some sort of artificial intelligence driven algorithms, which could actually create an elastic price elasticity based pricing mechanism. As long as people are not involved, it might still work. I'm
No,
just
that
making a
is
statement, Mari.
a
I just
very
want to get your perspective
intriguing,
on it.
idea. Like you said, we don't investigate that in our study. What I suspect is that an algorithm that sort of, if I understand your yeah, proposal sort of or suggestion correctly, that the algorithm would sort of obtain information from prospective donors and decide and identify a price that varies depending on the characteristics of the donor and willingness to accept, essentially. I suspect that some people might view this as unfair. That there would be a concern that poor people would obtain less compensation than richer people, which might introduce unfairness in the perception or in the system.
Yeah. So what I mean is that so there is a matching process you have to go through for kidneys. So assuming patient X requires a kidney,
Oh,
the algorithm can find the right match, and it can find the right amount of supply for that match, right? And that should set the price. So I'm not suggesting. So I'm agreeing with the population that says there has to be an intermediary that prices and acquires and allocates. But rather than the government doing it, I'm suggesting it is more intelligent central agency doing it. And if that is so, if it's driven by an algorithm, you can actually bring in some sort
got
of
it.
price
That is
elasticity based on
fascinating.
demand
There
and
is a
supply
very
as well.
active, branch of economics, market design, that is has been working on algorithms and matching algorithms and allocation of scarce resources. Uh, Specifically kidneys, the kidney exchange program that was introduced by, among others, but Alvin Roth is an example of that. Although there are no prices in that, no monetary prices in that algorithm. I mean, this is sort of I agree with you. It's sort of a new frontier, and it's not the necessarily obvious that algorithms are necessarily less biased than government agencies. Although one could design them, in that way, but then the design of the algorithm would need to really be extremely careful in avoiding biases.
Right, right. Yeah. We see a lot of problems today, right? And algorithms biases are its
That's right.
modelers biases or the
That's
historical
right. If
data it's
historical data
consumed
based
to
on which
actually
the
make it
algorithm,
work, right? So
learns and makes allocation decisions, if that data are themselves, the outcome of a biased, decision making process, then the algorithm will learn the wrong, the wrong, allocation rules.
yeah. So if you look forward 4 or 5 years, You looked at Canada, Australia, and the United States. You looked at blood, plasma, and kidney, and possibly other things. Where do you think we will be in terms of a policy stance? It appears very different from country to country. I don't know what EU generally is doing in this area. I don't know what developing countries, policies are in this area. What's your general view as
Yeah,
to
it's
where countries are
it's
heading
always
in this
difficult
dimension?
to make predictions, but my sense is that, like in the context of blood donation, that more and more blood banks are using certain, several types of incentives, and they're framing them in a way that they are not perceived as payment, but in a way that reinforces their donors motivation. So you reward your donors instead of you pay your donors. It makes a big difference, the way in which rewards or incentives are presented. So and in the context of um, uh, organ donation, my sense is that societies, not just the US, but also other societies, are moving towards sort of recognizing that giving a kidney, giving an organ, particularly kidneys that can be given by living, individuals, is costly, and that it is that is a fact, and that again there's consensus that no one should be made financially worse off. So although there is this repugnance factor to the idea of paying kidney donors or organ donors, there is sort of consensus that compensating donors for their costs, direct and indirect, is ethically appropriate. So what I think is going to happen is, and we already see some indication that this is happening, that the range of reimbursable expenses is expanding, and in recognition of the costs that donors face. And so we'll see, I think, more willingness to offer reimbursement for direct costs and indirect costs.
Yeah. So in summary, Mario, would you say that given all these case studies that we went through, 70 to 75% of the population appears to be generally okay with the compensation for a donation, but in many countries, policies appear to be lagging that societal
I think that that is an
preference.
accurate
Would you say that is
characterization
true?
in several countries. The U.S., based on my research, and in Canada, for sure. And so yes, I think that. But again, it's this. There's always some very vocal proponents or opponents of policies that
Mm.
participate in the public debate, whereas the majority of the population either is not aware or doesn't really have an interest in actively participating in the policy debate. So the result of so policies are often the result of conversations or debates between very vocal minorities, and so it's not obvious that the will of the
Mm. Mm.
majority will prevail, at least not in the short term. But again, my sense is that there is more and more consensus, even among those who participate actively in the policy conversation, that compensation to reimburse and make the donor whole, that's consensus for that. So that's where I see the action in the next several years.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I just want to touch on that very quickly. So, if we are in a situation that, as you say, the extreme position takers on a spectrum actually have a higher influence on ultimate policy, including lobbying and everything else, it doesn't really help to get public opinion into policies. And you can look at almost any policy today. There appears to be many policies that are totally opposite to almost three-quarters of the public desires that policy to be, but there is no mechanism to get
Yes,
this
I
information
think that
into the
is a
policy
great
making
observation.
process.
Now we are sort of going, outside of my area of expertise, but I would be very
Yeah.
interested in listening to a podcast where you discuss this the political economy of how do we get legislation passed, how do we get reform, what's the role of vocal minorities in shaping policy choices. And how can we get the voice of the people to play a greater role in shaping policy? I would love to listen to a podcast on
I'll work on that, Mario. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me on a weekend, and I really
that. This was great. My
appreciate this
pleasure,
research, and
Gil.
good luck
Thank you
with
very
everything that you
much.
do in this area. Thank you.